In this presentation we're going to look at some of the issues that we have in wireless security. It doesn't look at security in general, which is obviously a wider issue, but we'll focus on some of the key issues related to wireless technologies. So what is it that we actually have? Well, basically we have users, and normally we define the good users as Bob and Alice. Each of these users can have specific roles, such as staff or students. We have a range of devices in which we connect from and to, and unfortunately we also have Eve, who can be defined as our intruders. It is these intruders who are trying to modify data, change data, and so on. And it's up to us to be able to make sure that the intruders do not damage or compromise the system in any way. So we typically have access devices, and in this case we have a Cisco AeroNet, which is a standard device which is used in many corporations to provide wireless access. At the back end we have a network infrastructure built around switches and routers. We also have a range of services which provide typically on a role-based support. We can have an authentication infrastructure which we use to authenticate devices, roles, users, and so on. And we can also have domain rights to define what users and roles are allowed to implement on a system. So what are our main guiding lights? Well, typically we deal with CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and authentication, and it's these three things together that should give us a secure infrastructure. For confidentiality we use techniques such as encryption to be sure that we can keep data secret. We might also use hashing methods and encryption to make sure there is some assurance in data and in transmissions, and this defines the integrity, so that we can know that something that has been sent from someone hasn't been changed in any way. And then an increasing factor is the authentication of devices, users, servers, connections, and so on. Too many systems at present rely on authenticating the device, but in the future there will be much more towards authenticating actual people that are using certain services and applications. Along with this, we can also have accounting, where we can define logs for network activity, what services are used by what users, and so on. Along with this, we might implement some authorization for the rights of a system, and this will typically relate to what services they are allowed to use and what domain rights they have. So this is a basic roadmap for the future of wireless systems. Basically we have the supplicant, which is basically the user and device which connect to it. As we'll see, we can have various encryption standards, such as the highly flawed WEP standard, which uses RC4 encryption, WPA, which is an improvement but still uses the weak RC4 encryption method, and then the future is towards WPA or the AES encryption standard. We have an authenticator, and with this we can authenticate openly or with a shared key, but more increasingly we're using back-end authentication infrastructures such as Radius to authenticate users and devices onto the network. We can then also synchronize our back-end Windows domain server, so if a user changes their username and password on the system, it can be synchronized into the Radius server to make sure that their new password can be used to authenticate themselves onto the wireless network. We might also have a PKI server for us to be able to check the authenticity of our digital certificates. So the problem that we have is that if we provide wireless access from within inside our network infrastructure, then it means that Bob can have direct access to all the services that are required inside the network. Unfortunately, if we provide public access, then Eve could come along and get direct access to the core infrastructure. So she now gets behind the main firewall and can go in through this into the core network. So most companies tend to move the wireless access towards the DMZ to make sure that the access is done through the main firewall. The unfortunate thing about this is it does not integrate exactly with the network infrastructure. So a policy could be, a migration policy is to move away from fixed networks towards wireless systems. So as much as possible, companies should be investigating replacing fixed connections with a wireless connection, but to keep the same level of security. The internet is an extremely complex infrastructure, and the only way that we can actually debug and test and to identify problems is to abstract it in different layers. So typically this is a layer approach using a number of different layers of abstraction. For layer 1, we typically look at a physical layer. In the case of wireless systems, that's typically in terms of radio waves. At the layer above, we have a data link where we see Ethernet frames. The layer above that is layer 3, where we look at IP, the IP layer, and data packets. Above that, we look at creating a transport layer connections through ports and sockets with TCP. Above that, we look at session layers, and then at the very top, we look at an application layer. To be able to abstract some of the issues related to wireless systems, we'll look at a layered approach. In this case, we'll look at layer 1 issues. These are mainly related to the radio signals that travel through space. One of the major problems that we have is from signal jamming. So if we went for a complete wireless system for our corporate network, and someone nearby decides to set up an antenna which will send in radio frequencies to our network on the same channels that we're actually using, then their signals can actually swamp our signals. If it was someone malicious, then they could actually set up an extremely high-powered jamming signal for the whole of the corporate network. Some companies try to shield their external network to stop radio waves from leaving and going outside, and to stop external attacks, so that the shielding would stop external signals. But unfortunately, it can cause many problems for our own network, in that our own radio waves bounce off the shielding and come back. This causes what's called multipath problems. With multipaths, we might have an antenna here and a transmitter here. We have a ceiling and we have a floor. Multipath is caused when we can have multiple paths that a signal can go between a sender and a receiver. It could go direct off the ceiling and then off the floor. And the problem that we have is that if all these signals arrive out of phase, then they can cancel each other out and we can have a null path. Another problem that we have at layer 1 is that we can have continual connections from users. Even though in this case Eve isn't actually connecting to the access point, she continually asks for a connection which will be obviously rejected. But the wireless access point is then spending so long on dealing with these connections that the valid users feel a deprivation of bandwidth and do not get the right quality of service. The same thing can happen if someone continually tries to access and download or upload files, then the access point is spending so long on these files that other users can feel deprived of bandwidth. This problem is typically known as denial of service and is a major problem for access points. Typically these days what we define as a quality of service, where we can actually allocate guaranteed bandwidth to users or different types of applications, and we can make sure that data does not swamp other critical data, such as for voice. Another major problem that we have is that how can we tell that we have a valid access point that we're connecting to rather than a spoofed one. So in this case Eve has set up probably with the same SSID. So if we have a CorpNet SSID, then Eve could set up CorpNet close to the user. So the user, if they connect to the strongest signal strength, will connect into the spoof CorpNet and not to the valid one. This can be done and with a notebook. A notebook can be set up as an access point. As far as a user would know, someone sitting beside them with an access point, with a notebook which is set up as an access point, they could actually connect to that notebook, and then the data is actually streamed off and interrogated. One method that we can use to actually reduce the possibility of external connections is to set up two SSIDs. With a Cisco AeroNet we can set up OpenNet and CloseNet, and then we can allow our radio interface D0 to be able to support two SSIDs. OpenNet is seen as a guest mode with the maximum number of connections as 10, and then this one will actually be broadcast so that users can see OpenNet. In this case, CloseNet will not be broadcast, so only users which already have the SSID connection within inside the machine will be able to connect to the AeroNet. So this is not broadcast. This SSID will be transmitted every 2 seconds and broadcast its SSID to users. But as we can see, CloseNet will not broadcast. In this case, we allow 100 users onto CloseNet, but only 10 users at any given time onto OpenNet. Another particular problem that we have is that we have obviously wireless range for our signals, and unfortunately there are more and more wireless networks set up, and each of these wireless networks overlap each other, and these areas you can have interference of the radio signal and so on. So what we typically want to do is that we possibly want to rein in the range of our coverage of our access point. So this can be done within inside a Cisco AeroNet by defining the local power level. So by default it's typically 50 milliwatts. If we reduce it down to 30 milliwatts, then it will reduce the scope of the network so that no one will be able to connect over here, and we will not have overlapping networks. If we use Cisco cards too, it's possible to tell the wireless client on the notebook what power level to use. In this case, once a notebook connects to the access point tells the card to only use 10 milliwatts of power, so that can reduce the signal strength within inside the area. We typically have a number of channels. In the UK we can have channels 1 to 14. Unfortunately, because we use spread spectrum technology, then the actual frequencies interfere with other channels. So channel 1 will interfere with channel 2, 3 and 4 and so on. The channels that we can use which typically do not interfere are channels 1, 8 and 13. And companies typically set up an infrastructure which use these channels so that two of the same channel doesn't actually appear in the same physical span. So a user can walk through the space connecting to channel 8, then to channel 13, then to channel 1, channel 8, back to 13, and so on. Unfortunately, we might also have an external network which uses channel 2, and we can see in this case the radio signals will interfere in this region so that we get a reduced quality of service for channel 1. Another problem that we have is that web encryption is typically fairly easy to crack, so that Eve can listen to a whole lot of traffic, and then after a certain amount of time she is then able to find the encryption key. Once she finds the encryption key, then she can decrypt anything that's sent over the network. The new standard is now TKIP, which makes it much more difficult to crack. As we'll see the basic weaknesses of web in a future part of this lecture. Another issue that we have is that if we're transmitting wireless signals, then an intruder can actually locate where we are. Either this can be based on a cellular basis, where we know that the user is connecting to a certain access point, and we know that thus they're in a certain area, or if they can be seen by 3 access points, we can use basic triangulation such as signal strength, or for the delay between these access points to triangulate and pick up the location of a user. So this might have some privacy issues that we don't want users to be tracked. Same thing happens with a mobile phone. Typically the telephone network actually keeps a log and a track of where a mobile phone has actually been. Okay, so we've looked at some of the issues related to layer 1. Now we'll look at some basic layer 2 issues that we need to understand. One problem that we have is that we typically have an authentication infrastructure based around a radius server which will check the user credentials before they log in. At present, this can be based around the MAC address of a network card, so that when Bob logs in, he will pass his MAC address. It is then checked by the central radio server and tells the access point that he is allowed to log in. So you can see here, this is an example on the access point to set up a MAC list authentication. We set up AAA to make this available. Eve, though, actually knows what the valid MAC address is. She's managed to get to the machine, or in some way has managed to find out what a valid MAC address actually is. So we can see here, this is Bob's MAC address. Eve then changes her MAC address through spoofing to create a valid one, so that she can now log in to the access point and will be able to communicate. Typically what we do though is that we can deny using these access lists, MAC level access MAC filters. We can actually bar certain IP addresses that we don't actually want. If we found out that this MAC address is connecting, then this ACL will stop that node from connecting. But unfortunately she can spoof a valid MAC address and get around these problems. Another major design issue is that we want to separate users. Even though they connect to the same access point, the same switch, we need to make sure that they are physically or almost physically separate. For that, we typically implement VLAN technology. So in this case, we want to make sure that staff who connect onto this network are part of one network, students who connect to this network are part of another network. This machine should not be able to contact this machine in any way at this level. Same again, but these machines can communicate directly. Typically this is defined as an ARP or a broadcast domain. And we can do this directly on the AeroNet by defining that SSID is associated with VLAN 1 and this SSID is associated with VLAN 2. Then we can associate these two SSIDs with the AeroNet so that staff will connect to one VLAN and students will connect to the other one. It is only at layer 3 and through a layer 3 switch or a router that they can actually intercommunicate, and at this layer we can actually define the security between the two VLANs. But physically or virtually physically they should not be able to intercommunicate even though they are on the same IP subnet. Another problem that can happen is that Bob sends a probe to the access point, then sends a request and is validated. Then Eve sends a signal which is not heard by the access point to disassociate himself from it. So as long as the access point doesn't hear this signal, then Bob will disconnect and then Eve will actually hijack his session and pretend to be Bob. A way that Eve can use to pick up lots of traffic, the more traffic she picks up, the more chance she has to crack the keys. The more data that she has, the more intense she can make her investigation of the encryption, is for Bob to send an ARP request to the access point of which there's a reply. This will be encrypted. Eve listens to this and knows that it's an ARP request because it's a fairly small data packet. She then plays back that encrypted ARP packet again and again and again, and then continually gets the access point to keep sending information back to herself. She then builds up a large table and then can use that to determine the encryption key. This is known as ARP injection. Another problem that we have, and typically related to Bluetooth, many phones are enabled with Bluetooth and have Bluetooth on all the time. An intruder can then go nearby, hook into the Bluetooth, and then get, if they can get connected, get the phone to call a premium call site, which has already been set up by the intruder so that the number will be dialed and will be charged to the user, of which Eve can make some profit. Okay, so we've seen several issues at layer 1 and layer 2. There are even more issues when we move up to layer 3, and that's looking at the internet infrastructure. One problem that we have is that Eve could easily set up an access point and advertise it for free access inside a Starbucks coffee shop, inside an airport or a train station, even inside a train. And what Eve does is say that connection is free, but what she does is that she sets up and sends to Bob the preferred DNS server. In this case though, Eve runs the DNS and has poisoned it. So when Bob makes a query for eBay in this case, he goes and asks the domain name server for the IP address. Eve has poisoned it so that it will point to the eBay bill server here, which is run by Mal. And then when Bob connects, he will not go to the eBay server, but he will go to the Mal server. Then at the Mal server, he's faced with a page which looks like eBay, but you can see here it's been compromised in some way. This is an extension of a phishing type attack where a perfectly valid looking site is set up, even with a perfectly valid looking URL and domain name. This is known as DNS poisoning, and is a particular problem in wireless systems as they are so open to be connected into, and many users are looking for free access, especially if they're on the move. So it could be for a hotel access point and so on. But you often have no idea if you're connecting to someone next door or to a perfectly valid access point. Another problem that we have is that we typically use network address translation inside our access point, where we have a private address space inside which maps to a public one. This has many advantages in that intruders cannot connect directly into our machine, but it can have problems. If Eve manages to get access to the network address translation table, then she can cause many problems and can even redirect any traffic from a valid site to an invalid site. So this device should always be highly secure to stop users logging in and changing its network address translation table. Also, it is possible, once there is a connection from NAT to a server, to have a backtracking attack where a user can then log back in to the system. So for this, Mal has set up connecttome.com, has attracted Bob in. Once Bob connects, then there is now a backtrack through the access point onto the user's machine. These are backtracking and redirection. Another problem that we might have is with IP spoofing. In this case, Eve finds out the IP address that Bob is using. Bob logs on, and in the audit log we can see here that Bob accesses alice.com twice. Bob logs off, and then Eve connects, but then Eve changes her IP address to be Bob's, so that the audit log now shows that Bob connected to mal.com twice. So we can see here that the credibility of using an IP address as an authentication, and for not to check this is not good for auditing purposes. So what steps should we make? Basically, if we're on the move and we have sensitive data and we're connecting back to a corporate infrastructure, we need to make sure that we create a VPN connection with our corporate network. This allows us to tunnel through the wireless network and also through the internet. So no device along there will be able to read the traffic. So Eve, no matter if she listens to the signals at all or is at any part of the communications, she can't decrypt it. So we can see here this is our VPN server. Typically this happens near the gateway of a network. It is then unencrypted onto the network so that we can check it for viruses and the basic services. Most corporate networks do not support an end-to-end tunnel because we cannot check the basic services and the maliciousness of data packets. We typically put it at some sort of boundary or gateway to the corporate network. One of the main areas of confusion in wireless is around the basic security standards. It probably has more acronyms than many other technologies, with WEP, WPA, 11i, 1X, and so on. So this part of the lecture will look at some of the basic security standards, understand where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going. Basically, for security, we can go for an out-of-the-box solution of Ipsec, or more increasingly SSL type tunnels with things like WebVPN. Unfortunately, these are limited to IP networks, but they're certainly required for public access systems. The main standards for encryption break out into encryption standards and authentication. For encryption, we have the horrible WEP protocol, which is based on RC4 stream encryption. This has been shown to have many problems, and we've now moved towards using TKIP and part of the WPA infrastructure. But the future is towards robust block encryption using the AES standard. For authentication, we tend to now use the 1X or EAP framework, where we can get multiple different methods of authenticating devices and users onto a system. So this is just as important as this. If we can make sure that the two fit together, encryption and authentication, then we have a much better secure system. So basically, for security levels, WEP using RC4 was extremely poor security. It has open open system authentication or shared key, where we can share a key between the access point and the client. These have been seen to be easily to be compromised. The short-term fix is towards WPA, which builds on RC4 but uses a session key which times out after a certain amount of time, and it shouldn't be crackable. We're now starting to see this EAP infrastructure for authentication. So encryption and authentication are built together. The next step is towards more robust encryption using AES and proper authentication, and then we move properly to what's called the 802.11i standard for a complete secure infrastructure. Many of the technologies here have been implemented because of the problems to do with this standard. But what will happen is that much of these protocols will be implemented in a normal fixed network. It's just that the issues have been proven with inside wireless. One thing we do need to understand is where is the encryption happening and where is our data safe. So we need to understand the scope of the encryption. On a wireless network, basically we're only covered for wireless encryption over the network layer. So we can see here that we have some data, it then gets encrypted here at the wireless layer, it is then sent to the access point. But wherever we go back up to layer 3, it is then unencrypted. So any ISP, any part of the internet which is operating at layer 3 can actually have a look at the data, and if Eve is here, then Eve can actually modify any of the data packets. When it goes back out on the network, we can encrypt it again, and then it's then decrypted. So we can see here that everything over the actual connection is encrypted, but anything above that isn't. For a more secure system, we implement something like an Ipsec, which allows us to negotiate keys, encryption keys, from one end to the other, so that the complete transmission over the internet and even up into the higher layers will be kept secure, so that only this device and this device will be able to read the communications, because only they have the encryption keys. At a level above, we can have secure sockets, and for web, this is where web VPN works. Secure sockets, we have a negotiation when the connection is made between the two applications. They pass some keys, and then everything is encrypted downwards. So it wouldn't matter if we had encryption here or here, because it's already encrypted here, and anything that's encrypted at this layer will be covered. Other information can be gleaned obviously from the MAC addresses, from IP addresses and so on, because they will be also sent. And then at the application layer with HTTP, FTTPS, we encrypt right at the core level of the application, so that it is secure all the way down. Again, information on ports and sockets, IP addresses and MAC addresses are not encrypted, because only this part of it, each part adds their own little bit, and this will be unencrypted. So if we want to be sure, we might encrypt here. We might also encrypt with secure sockets. We might also have a web IPsec, and we might also have wireless encryption. Each part will secure their little bit of the information that's added. So basically the scope of wireless encryption is only local. The scope of VPN encryption is over the whole of the internet infrastructure. So we need to understand, if it's just local encryption we require, this is fine. If we need to make sure it's end-to-end, then we need some VPN connections. Okay, so let's look at one of the most disastrous security protocols ever created, and that is the disaster area, which is web, one of the weakest security standards that has ever been created. And it was unfortunate because it was developed mainly by the force of manufacturers to get products to market without standards agencies and researchers investigating basic flaws in it. So basically what we do is that we typically define a passphrase, which in itself is a fairly insecure method, because this can be attacked by a dictionary attack, where a standard dictionary will generate a range of keys, so we don't have to search the whole key space. The keys themselves are then converted into some binary format. In this case it's hexadecimal. We have a 64-bit key, but only 40 bits are used for the key itself and 24 for an initialization vector. So the value that we come to is each of these hexadecimal characters is worth 4 bits. So we have 10 characters, so this defines a 40-bit key. So when we set up our key, we look for 10 hexadecimal characters. For 128-bit, we have 104-bit keys, and this shows the characters that we actually have. This is then used between the access point and the clients. Both have this shared key already stored in it. The access point can also be sent to send out the web key as a broadcast to whoever connects, so that the clients do not have to be set up with them. So we can see here that we have a passphrase which creates a key, and then we can see here that we have web encryption on channel 6 for an SSID of Fred. This shows another example for 128-bit. Basically how it happens is that we take a plain text, we take the key, we put it into the RC4 algorithm, and then we need some way of changing the key for every time that we send it. If we do not change the key, it is fairly simple for somebody to actually derive the original key. So the method that's been implemented is called the initialization vector. With this, we start off with a value, say, of 1, next data frame sent 2, 3, 4. So the key itself seems to be changing. So we put the IV vector and the secret key into RC4, and we get a pseudo-infinite key sequence. We then take each bit as it comes along for the data we have to send, and we exclusive OR our key with the plain text, and we get, in this case, a 1 and a 0 gives us 1, a 1 and a 1 gives us 0, and so on. So each bit that comes along is encrypted to give us a cipher stream. The problem with this is that a 15-byte data packet also becomes a 15-byte data packet on the output. If it wasn't for this initialization vector, it would be extremely simple for somebody to take data and exclusive OR each data frame together, and it wouldn't take too long to actually crack the key. Okay, so this shows the operation. We take our 40-bit key, stick it in with our IV vector, and then we get this infinite stream. We take our data stream, exclusive OR together, and then we get our output. On the other side, the great thing about exclusive OR is that we just do the same again, and then we get the original data back again. So this was implemented because it was fairly fast and it didn't need too much heavy hardware. Unfortunately, it's flawed. What we can do is that basically there is a simple checksum done on each of these columns for 32 bits, and a 1 and a 1 and a 0 gives us 0, 1 and a 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1 plus 1 plus 1 gives us 1, and we do a basic checksum at the very end. The device checks that eventual checksum to make sure that all the bits tie up. But what we can do is flip 2 bits in the same column so that we end up with the same checksum. In this case, Eve wants to change, say, the character here from an A to a B. She knows at what position the A is and flips a bit here, and she will flip a bit at another area. And as far as the received data is concerned, everything is fine, the checksum is okay, but the actual message, even though it's in ciphertext, has been changed. And it's been shown that what needs to happen is that if an intruder saves all the ciphertext for the IV vectors, eventually the IV vector rolls round to the same value it was sometime in the past. We can exclusive OR the 2 ciphertexts received, and do a basic statistical analysis, and out pops the key. So if we do a quick calculation, there are about 16 million different IV vectors. We do a quick calculation on the time to send a data frame, say about 1 millisecond. So after 18,000 seconds, the IV vector of constant traffic, the IV vector will roll over to be the same value again. A quick calculation is 5 hours. So after 5 hours, an intruder, after storing all the ciphertext, can actually crack the key. So this is how it would be done: ciphertext, and then eventually the IV vector rolls over, and an exclusive OR of the two values, with a statistical analysis to say that E is the most popular character, say followed by T, and then so on, and then Eve can crack the encryption key. It's possible because you can actually map, you can see IP and TCP headers because the Ethernet frame doesn't change at all. It's possible for Eve to go into the IP header and decide to flip some bits in the IP address here, so that rather than going to alice.com, the Eve sends the data to mal.com. This shows an example of the setting up of the encryption key. We can see here 10 hexadecimal characters gives us our 40-bit key, and this is an example of setting up a 128-bit key. So we can make it WEP as optional, again WEP optional here, or we can go for a cipher of TKIP or WEP 128. We will not allow standard WEP in this case. Okay, so we've identified the problems, and let's not dwell on the weaknesses and problems of the past. Let's now look at how we create proper infrastructures for the future, and this tends to be the guiding light of 802.111i. With this, what we make sure is that no one is allowed onto a wireless network unless they are properly authenticated. Encryption keys will come from the server and then will be regenerated after certain time intervals. So our authentication is done through a radio server. We have encryption keys which are dynamically created and not statically defined with inside machines. And we also have a centralized policy where we can time out connections and so on. So this standard is built around the 802.1x authentication infrastructure with EAP methods. So basically where we are just now is here with WPA. WPA has now advanced the encryption with TKIP, which increases the IV vector, so it takes longer for it to roll over, and it also creates it as a session key, so that there is no chance that the IV vector will roll over, because the session key will time out after a certain amount of time and be refreshed, so that Eve cannot listen to all the IV vectors and for it to roll it over again. But our future is towards a new standard using WPA. This will use a block encryption standard rather than stream encryption, and will obviously require a bit more computing power. So this uses the AES standard and isn't based on RC4. It also integrates the 1x standard for authentication of clients and access points using EAP methods. Basically, 1x gets in between the network implementation layer and IP, and creates an infrastructure where we can drop in the authentication method that we require for our system. And 1x can take virtually anything from usernames and passwords to client-side certificates to server-side certificates, and then even mobile phones through their SIM card. So 1x is the basic framework which allows this authentication to happen and to be compatible with a whole range. It's been forced for 11, the 11B, 11G standard, but it's also the same for Ethernet, where we can actually authenticate users onto a network through 1x, such as through a SIM card that they might have that they plug into a node. Okay, so authentication is probably just as important as encryption, and authentication focuses on trying to identify users, devices, servers, and so on. If we can get this right, then we have proper accounting logs. We can also have improved authorization. So our basic structure is that for the future is that the user will not be able to log on to an access point straight off without being properly authenticated onto the system. So some of the basic methods that we have is that we have EAP-TLS. EAP-TLS identifies the client with a digital certificate. So the client has a certificate which it then passes to the back-end authentication server. It's checked by our PKI server, so we can authenticate the client correctly. So what we have is that it's fairly good for security, but we're not identifying the access point itself. So we could have a spoof access point. We provide our certificate. The certificate is then used to create a tunnel in which we provide our username and password. The last thing we want is to log in with a username and password which could be easily seen. With EAP-TLS, we use our certificate to create that initial tunnel, and then that allows us to pass our secure details for our login. For EAP-TTLS, again we tunnel and we use a digital certificate. This time the digital certificate comes from the access point. The user is asked whether to accept it or not. Most of the time they will actually say yes without actually checking it. Once that certificate is used, it can then be used to encrypt the data for the tunnel in order to pass the user credentials on. Good thing with this is that we're creating a tunnel for the login, but we can have a spoof client, and that there is no authentication from the client to the server. Leap has been shown to be one of the most compromised systems, and with this we log in with a username and a password, and unfortunately this username and password is sent without a tunnel, but in clear text using a hash method of the password. This hash method can be opened to a dictionary type attack where someone can easily reverse engineer a hash to the original password. So Leap is open to a dictionary attack. And the asleep system can actually break the Leap protocol, and it's basically because the MS Chat version 2 system is a poor method of authenticating. So you can see here, this is our system that we have, and that we might have a certificate that's downloaded to a client and accepted. The public key is popped off that, and then that is used to encrypt traffic onto the system. We can have a back-end Windows domain server which is synchronizing usernames and passwords into the Radius server, and the PKI server is used to store our digital certificates and to validate. For PEEP, PEEP sends a digital certificate to the device. That digital certificate is then used for what's called inner authentication. Inner authentication then allows the user to pass their username and password and be validated onto the system. So in this way we keep things secure. PEEP supports both digital certificate and also a secure way of username and password. PEEP seems to be the way that many companies are actually going, in that it synchronizes quite well with a username and password system on a Windows system, but also uses a certificate to keep this communication secure. This shows an example of how we set up radius on our access point. This is for a local system. If you're interested, networksims.com has a simulator which will show some examples of radius for local and also for a back-end radius server. Set up our encryption key, and then when we connect, we should be able to see that we're connected to EAP or through a local radius server. So conclusions, we've looked at many different things, but really these are probably the tip of the iceberg. The key thing is for us to perform a risk analysis of how we actually work and to define what are the main risks involved and to try and mitigate against them. There is no magic bullet that will make sure that everything is 100% risk free, but we need to understand how we operate. Thank you.